Zaha was this kind of engine of mutation. She just kept sketching unrelated to projects, new graphic structures, new ideas. And then when it came a project, we looked at what can we use, what could be applied, like self-organizations, interpenetration, fluid, making fluid and flattening hierarchies and making connections, and the concept of networks and the blurring of boundaries, the discipline integration, and working on the frontier of architectural capacities, ingenuity, technology. Eventually these works will be not only generate more benefit, but also have lower costs. But oftentimes what we feel is, when we see that some of these approaches are not, they scare clients still a little bit. So a lot of our colleagues' architecture are of that kind of degree of simplicity and like an earthworm. And what we do are more kind of intricately articulated and evolved organisms, if you like. I'm on the right side of history, but 90% of the world are on the wrong side of history. It's no longer architecture, it's the end of architecture. It's a bleak outlook, but that's what we're facing. It's very depressing. So if I look around in London and when I see what's being built, it's very conservative. It's very much what could have been designed easily 80 years ago, 100 years ago even. What would be the St. Peter's of today? So I have these dreams of projects which are surpassing everything which has ever been seen. And I think with the sufficient challenge of brief sight and budget, we could deliver something which outshines St. Peter by a mile.
I want to talk about your own architecture and experience. You don't remember, but in 2006, so almost 20 years ago, I interviewed you at the Mercer Hotel in New York. This was taking place at the almost empty restaurant of the hotel, but in the corner there was Zaha Hadid herself sitting, speaking with her clients. It was a couple, and they were discussing a house. I understand that it was a house that was supposed to be designed somewhere in New York State. I'm not sure if it was ever built. It was supposed to be done in the form of a flower. And I remember that they were, at some points, they were speaking so intensely that our conversation was interrupted a few times, and we were both paying attention to what was discussed. I don't know if you remember that part, but that was...
I remember us sitting in the Royalton with our usual hotel when we came to New York. I don't remember the particular client or the project you're mentioning. It certainly hasn't materialized. So maybe that's why I kind of
This was this was taking place in 2006. So this is when the major retrospective the Guggenheim.
Wow, yeah, that's a long time ago, yeah.
And this was the moment, I think, very important for the practice, because all of a sudden all of us in the profession realized that Zaha Hadid was not just paper architect, but many buildings were being realized in at least 10 different countries at the same time. So the whole new world was in a way rising.
What's the major takeoff? I mean, let's say from 2004 to 2008, we went from 40 to 450, or from 25 to 450. I mean, it was an amazing boom period, slightly unsustainable because we hit the 2008 crash. We had all these projects in Dubai and UAE and all over the Middle East, but also across Europe, and which was a year later, the European debt crisis closed that down. We had project nearly in every city of Spain and some other European countries. So yeah, it was amazing for us, and it was amazing to see that we could fill the whole Guggenheim Museum with our works. Models, drawings, paintings, installations, the whole RAM, all the RAMs and all the site extension, big rooms. And it was a pleasure, yeah. So good moment for us. And at that point, the idea of parametricism has been spreading. By that time, it has been spreading for over 10 years. I founded the design research lab at the AA 10 years earlier, and we shifted to computational design and had more and more explored these new tools and new methodologies and also formal repertoires, organizational repertoires on all scales, from urbanism to interior and everything in between. So it was exciting moment. And this dynamic kind of got halted post 2008. Wasn't immediately obvious, but in 2008, innocently, we published the manifesto on parametricism at the Biennale in 2008. I had to start talking about it a year earlier. Of course, the phenomenon was going on for 10 years already by that time or more. And then we had no idea that it would relatively soon unravel, not as a core group, we kept going and developing it, but the kind of surge of more and more people joining in, and particularly the schools of architecture being more and more following and uh, building that trend and becoming hegemonic, that didn't take place. Because of, I think, 2008, a lot of the opportunities were no longer there. You had Occupy Wall Street, you had back to basics, anti-capitalism spreading. So that was the um, beginning of the end, unfortunately, of that, what we now call the end of architecture, where it should have been the beginning of the massive takeover and take off for parametricism. And tectonism at the time already existed as well, because a lot of schools of architecture and young firms had been exploring organizational diagrams and new forms of continuity and interarticulation, and then discovered that you have to kind of, how do we structure this? How do we uh, realize it technologically through cladding, tessellations, through space frames? How do you bring aperture into these openings, connections? And then how do you fabricate this? So that all had happened the late 90s, early 2000s. So we had a high point. It took me a few years, nearly another 10 years, to then articulate that tectonism. So it always takes longer when to summarize in retrospect a movement, but the tectonism movement, which kicked off for seriously in that period, was a smaller movement because it was the core people of parametricism kept going, kept deepening, kept investing. And of course, you have that wonderful world of Grasshopper and Grasshopper plugins and all this machine building and robotics introduction in the schools of architecture. So that was still interesting, but it was a no longer the whole of the field. It was a slice, an increasingly slightly shrinking but maturing slice. And that's also what I talk about the end of architecture. It's not, a total washout, because we kept progressing capacities, and we had a kind of sub-discourse, niche discourse through some of these conferences like Arcadia and Smart Geometry, and we have the whole world of Grasshopper, etc. We have the Philip Block Research Group, we have ETH and etc. We have this, Achim Menges at Stuttgart, the Design Research Lab, MTech at the AA, etc. So there's something kept going, but the broad majority of the field was no longer, we kind of severed off.
Yeah, I will ask you more about parametricism a little later, but I want you to maybe reflect a little bit on the time when you just met Zaha in 19. I understand that it happened in 1988 when
That's right.
deconstructivist ideas were discussed with the 7 architects, and she was one of the 7. She was the youngest. She was most appealing. You described it in one of your texts, and even there was a text following her passing in 2016 or 2017, a little bit later, where you described that conference. And I find it absolutely incredible because you were an exchange student at the time, studying in London, were planning to go back to Stuttgart to continue your education, but you decided to stay in London and go work with her. So if you could
That's
talk
fine.
about that decision that completely changed your life.
Well, that decision, was clear that London or Stuttgart, which one you choose. But it was also, the excitement of getting admitted into Zaha's studio, which was very small. I hadn't noticed her work at Stuttgart because I was just beginning my studies and I saw this global architecture publication, so the Japanese publication of some of her works, the peaks, the paintings, these fantastic drawings. There was also a small publication from the AA, this kind of box set, planetary architecture. So I was quite aware. And when I came to London in '87, I joined the South Bank with many other German students and was a mixed class in terms of British and German. And Kevin Robert was the teacher, and we learned quickly about deconstructivism. Not that this name was to begin with familiar, but the protagonists, Zaha, Eisenman, etc. We looked at their works, and Kevin Robert was also contributing to something which was first called the New Spirit in Architecture. There was an architectural review issue coming out, which collected some of the same protagonists under the heading New Spirit in Architecture. So there wasn't yet deconstructivism. So, but then we I saw the announcement for this conference, and I was lucky to go and witness Zaha, and she was very charming and very genuine, whereas the guys were showing off and seemed less genuine. And she just showed what she was trying to do, what she was working on. And the works were more sophisticated, I thought, more complex, more resolved and powerful than of all the other, let's say, deconstructivists. Although, and I had been hanging around at the AA where she was still teaching, but she never came. So she had one or two students she was teaching at the office or at home. And but I was hanging out at the A, so seeing what's going on and learning about the post-structuralist. The theoretical kind of wrapper around this deconstructism thing, the works of Foucault, Derrida, etc., and learned about the collaboration between Schumi and Derrida. So I was quite familiar with deconstructism, and yeah, it was nice to be admitted. It was a super small studio. There was only 3 or 4 employees, but the studio could grow when there was a competition. It wasn't continuous. There were a lot of her ex-students, and she had a great unit at the AA for several years. You could also look that up. I looked that up in the library, the project reviews of the early '80s into the '85, '86, I think, her last studio, with the protagonist then coming and working with her and with us on competitions. That's the way the studio was, and she had just opened that space, which was an old school building in '86. So 2 years before I came. And before that, she was working from home or from sometimes maybe abusing AA spaces, I guess, to do these competitions. So it was really at the very beginning, and it was very kind of exciting and stimulating to work because we had no real work, but we did these competitions and we had outlets like exhibitions. So we had a show at the ICA. There was a show at the ICA, actually, I think in '88 or '87. And then we had a show in the ADIS gallery in Berlin where we contributed. So there was and publications. So we felt what we're doing was in the public eye, when the was noticed in the discipline. So that was also stimulating, and we thought we were breaking new grounds. And so it was an exciting time. So there's no way that I would have just kind of go back to Stuttgart. I did have to go back to finish my project. I only had left a diploma to do. I did this 2 years later, fully tooled up and let's say idea-wise, geared up to do a good project uh, quickly and to return immediately.
So when I interviewed you years ago, I asked you about the influence on Zaha, your influence on Zaha, and you said, I like to think that I radicalized some aspects of her work by bringing more complexity. I came to the office early. The work could have gone in many directions, many different directions. In its development, you can see the influence of many hands and minds. I tried to move it away from sharp angles into the direction of curvilinearity, fluidity, and seamlessness. If you could touch a little bit on how that language started mutating, changing, and when and how the curves appeared.
Well, the curves, I mean, have been there for quite a while, and that was also which made it different from some of the other deconstructivists. And there were also other themes of deconstructivism, superimposition. She had in her early work. She picked that up even in her student work. And it also came partly out of the observing the Russian constructivists or suprematists, these kind of layered graphics, Moholy Notch, for instance, or Elisitsky, etc. So that was one element, but the curve came early in her work. She was a kind of collections of French curves and ship curves, and we had specially made ship curves. This was before we used computers. So that was there, but maybe there was also a lot of sharp angles and distortions. What I think, where I would put it there, yes, there could have been many ways, and there was a tendency to potentially to be more like a retro 50s thing, kidney shapes, and a little bit too much influenced by cartoons. So in a way, in cartoons, a lot of lines get curved and things are elastic. And so there was, and this kind of facility of sketching and cartoon-like sketching was a lot of her students did that. So I think I was um, trying to tie it in more with um, have more strangeness, complexity, elegance as well, and move away from cartoon-like projects. But mostly, I think what was really important for me, which emerged in the early 90s, where I was, where we had communication with somebody like Jeff Kipnis, when he was at the AA. He came in 91, 92. He came to the office and we communicating. I was then looking at the work of Greg Lynn. And then we went to Columbia in 93 and meeting him and Jesse Reiser. There was this kind of, and the work of Eisenman folding the Frankfurt project. So there was something going on which was different from the deconstructivist idea of collage, something more coherent, something more continuous. And there were certain notions and concepts put forward which made sense. And we were early on connecting with this. So I was saying kind of Zaha was the youngest deconstructor and became, one of the most mature, let's say, teams joining that younger group, which was running soon under the headline of folding in architecture. So that I was helping that along. And Zaha also liked it, and she was very friendly with Jeff, Kipnis, and Greg. We became friends, and then what we saw happening at Columbia University that year from 93 into 94, 95, that many other young architects, emerging architects, vision architects, they converged onto this paradigm. So Hani Rashid, and Asymptote, or Bill McDonald, Colotang McDonald. Ben van Berkel was actually Zaha's student, as well as Farshid Alejandro with becoming front office architects. So you had people from Eisenman's office, OMA, Ben, etc. So they all converged to this paradigm, and I kind of helped that along, that we are fully embedded in that. And then with the founding of DRL in 96, taking over from Kipnis studio and making it bigger and more mature. That's, I think, there I see my contribution of directing the company in Zaha into this way. She was always slightly resistance of being part of a movement. She never said I'm a deconstructivist. She was always a bit skeptical. Of course, she was proud to be part of that illustrious show, but didn't kind of, you'll never hear talk about Derrida, for instance. And equally, when this kind of shifted to Deleuze and this new group, she was slightly hesitant and resistant and didn't want to talk about Deleuze. Uh, so, but she allowed it to happen because there's also with the absorption of all these computational tools which started to be developed, and we started to introduce them in the office as well. So that's where my influence is. It could have been going elsewhere, as I said, with the kind of neo-50s thing, or where even OMA was. I mean, which was in a sense a kind of version of postmodernism. If you look at the Dutch dance theater with OMA project, it's kind of a neo-50s thing. It, of course, it connects with this whole punk, let's say, new wave and neo-50s aesthetics, fashion aesthetics of the 80s. Did you remember that? So there was a potential there of going in this direction, or staying more with the deconstructivists, although most of them eventually came through as well. Whether even Himmelblau and the Eisenman office, that developed more into what became folding, and later on we called it parametricism. So that's where I think I was uh, also co-steering, let's say, the direction. Yeah.
When you talk about your work, you use such phrases as seamless fluidity, soft transitions, organic variation, computational intelligence, expansion of repertoire, stylistic unity, spatial dynamism, polycentral and multi-directional compositions, three-dimensional sensation, continuous differentiation, rhythms and flows, structural logic adapting to climatic conditions, expressive richness, transformative impact on the planet's physiognomy, like endless forms in nature, and consistently beautiful. How else would you describe your work, and what kind of architecture do you try to achieve?
So I think what is important, um, we have on the one hand, we have this kind of repertoire expansion, which Zaha was always interested in already. But through computational tools and looking at computer graphics, and also looking at certain analogies or nature and organic nature and inorganic nature and landscape analogies, we get a lot of new concepts and morphologies which could be relevant for architectural design, and then with the tools could be promoted. So that's just natural. If you had more repertoire, more options, a larger solution space, you can adapt your project better to functional requirements, social requirements, and also because we're going into complex urban settings, this idea of multiple affiliation is another phrase, and having the form plastic so it can fit in and modulate itself to attach itself and make connections and fit itself into odd-shaped environments and mediate levels. All of that, these are, of course, degrees of freedom which help to make the solution better fitted and more high performance.
There is
So that's
another word, embeddedness, right?
Embeddedness as well, because if you come into an existing urban context, the client seeks out a site, he wants to be close to various other facilities and institutions, and then you want to kind of maybe connect to them, gesture to them, make symbiotic relations with them from a functional level that should be formally expressed. And these ideas have been also kind of be picking up from somebody like Eisenman and Lynn. So it was very kind of conceptually fertile, and a lot of that was coming out of Deleuze's Thousand Plateaus, a lot of these kind of ideas. And that was the very productive period, and that's really was establishing the new paradigm now. But my role was to see the performative potency and functional rationality of all of that. Because when it comes to Peter Eisenman, Lynn, Jesse Reiser, all these Americans, they are formalists. And Eisenman himself, in particular, Jeff Kipnis, aggressively so, refusing to see these as functionally driven. And it's a kind of post-functionalism. And I respect to some extent the formalist attitude allows you to be more freewheeling and explorative, and you don't have to worry inhibit your creativity at that point by functional constraints. But it can't be, of course, the final story. But you can generate formal research, which I believe is important, but then you need to look at it as a problem-solving repertoire. Formal repertoires are problem-solving repertoires. So if I would characterize my role in the overall, let's say, movement of what I later called parametricism, which was, as I said, captured the imagination of a whole generation, it was insisting on the programmatic functional advantages and rationalities, because we also were a firm already working on projects. So while using these repertoires, they become problem-solving repertoires. Why? Because we have to solve problems and we have to meet constraints and explain to clients the advantages of our science. So if you're more of an academic like Kipnis and even Greg, where you don't have jobs, you can be a pure formalist and feel great about it, and then you kind of so that was my role, and I was particularly interested in to tie what we're doing with this historical transformation of capitalism and industrial societies from Fordism to post-Fordism, which had a number of features which we recognize in and somehow intuitively expressed in deconstructivism and folding. First of all, the moving back into urban concentrations and cities rather than spreading out onto the green fields with new towns and greenfield offices and factories spreading out and sprawl. The new economy is an economy of faster cycles of innovation, of integration, where you have outsourcing and small and network organizations, and you pool together for innovative project by project rather than running assembly line for 30 years. You have this kind of knowledge economy emerging, synergy clusters emerging. That means you layer new into old and you make connections rather than being undisturbed. I make my territory and I don't need to communicate. So I was very clear that a lot of these features of deconstructivism and then also the layering and superimposition and integration of multiple systems, you find reflections of this in the way the dynamics of the economy work, and also you find very much reflections in the world of management consulting and organization theory, the matrix organization, the network organization. They were talking about the blurring of boundaries between departments, multiple affiliation. We're talking about is multiply. You are part of many teams simultaneously. simultaneity in the sense and networking and self-organization of networks of competency instead of pre-conscribed hierarchies. All of these phrases, and interestingly, Deleuzian-Guattari's language fits into this intuitively because the left resistance to these new capitalist dynamics, they also were no longer the kind of hierarchical Stalinist cadre party. They were the autonomia movement, free flow of currents, of networks of resistance, leadership, guerrilla war, fluid leadership, etc., etc. So this kind of new sociology fitted into the left. It also came into business organizations. And so that I tie in the repertoires and rhetoric and formalisms of deconstructivism and then folding into parametricism with the kind of new post-Fordist network and knowledge economy dynamics. And that's my role, one of my roles. And I didn't fully succeed in this. I don't feel I have enough followingship in this. And that leads to a lot of misunderstanding about this movement. Parametricism itself, most protagonists went more technology oriented or formalist oriented, and then they're more and more technology oriented and not so much sociology and socioeconomically oriented. It's partly also to do with that fact, as I said, that it was still to a large percent academic and research based. I mean, research institutes, PhDs, etc., and they were not in the real world. We were trying to win big master planning competitions where we also had to talk about the urban dynamics and so on. So that's where I feel that intellectually that's been my role, and I think these kind of notions and teachings, let's say, have a lot of validity. And I had, for instance, at the A forever, my theory seminar was pairing up always articles and architectural theory articles with socioeconomic or corporate organization or business organization articles and show the interconnections. Because what I found fascinating because on the one hand, if you look at some of these deconstructivist composition or later on particular parametricist kind of complex compositions, they feel exuberant, they feel irrational, they feel don't get the rationality of them, and oftentimes there aren't. But if I can demonstrate that the most advanced and hard-nosed business organizations are talking using the same phrases, like self-organizations, interpenetration, making fluid and flattening hierarchies and making connections and the concept of networks and the blurring of boundaries, all of these slogans you find in the management literature. And to show that when we did these kind of corporate fields, business organization, and that's still an interesting topic for me. We also did BMW central building, and we pitched for we had Sberbank technology campus. So we have some of those projects, the various headquarters, where this makes a lot of sense. So that was also, I thought, very important that we can see the historical pertinence and power of these repertoires and this paradigm of architecture aligning with the most advanced business and socioeconomic prosperity engines. This is the built environment for the prosperity engine of the 21st century. And as a kind of coming from a Marxist heritage, where productivity gains and the development of the force of production is really driving history, that we are on the right side of history. And that's why we pitched for Google, and I would have loved to do Google Campus. And in the end, when Bjarke and Thomas did the Google Campus, what did it look like? It was exactly what I was pushing a few years earlier at the GSD, doing Google Campus or DRL kind of style project, huge kind of shell with open fluid, multi-level playing field. That means, but of course in the wrong place because they're still in Palo Alto kind of suburban campus. They should be embedded in urban conditions. So I feel I'm still on the right side of history long term. Uh, and but then again, advanced societies are themselves kind of blocking themselves and paralyzing themselves. So that in Europe, since the financial crisis, we have 15 years of stagnation, architecture stagnating, but economically stagnating despite this amazing takeoff of technology through robotics and software service, proliferation of the internet, as well as now AI. None of this is coming through. And that's the kind of indictment of, in a way, I'm on the right side of history, but 90% of the world are on the wrong side of history, including the architecture of the world.
I like that attitude. Can you talk about your design process and where do you derive inspirations from? You just talked about this idea of being program driven, but what about the form? I know that
No,
you,
of course. Look, there you need to marry new
yeah,
form with new program, new functionality with new form, and you have to dissociate. You can't do it in one go. So basically, so the formalists, I mean, the Dutch, Rem and MVRDV and these guys, they think they can only work with program, but they have a formal a priori, which is more or less boxes within boxes, or they have some kind of highly constrained formal repertoire, and they think they can only think they can advance program just on the basis of thinking of new program relationships, but they always fit them into grids and so on. So that's highly programmatic. You can't do it. You can't derive um, new form from new program or program. So you need to independently match them and explore them separately. So the same also way nature evolves its endless forms of nature. All the forms of nature they continuously repurposed. They evolve for one purpose and then discover capacities which then kind of trigger the next iteration and maybe refinement. So I believe in formal research. So, but of course, it's difficult to do that for every job, in particular if you only have 4 weeks to finish a completely, or 6 weeks, photorealistically developed competition. So you need to have separate arenas for formal research. And that means inside the office, Zaha was this kind of engine of mutation. She just kept sketching unrelated to projects, new graphic structures, new ideas. And then when it came a project, we looked at what can we use, what could be applied. Similarly, when we did teaching, the teaching arenas was these kind of explorations of repertoires, and AA, we've always done not form to program. So we're starting with systems, computational techniques, what do they generate, generative systems, formal systems, um, you know, whether it's continuous surfaces in the early days or blobs and metaball compositions or swarms and swarm formations, various magnetic field kind of interference pattern, formal structures, not knowing yet, exploring them, developing the tools, the algorithms, a lot of physical form finding like Kyoto, and then hunting for what could these things be useful for. So you just build up the repertoire and then bring program in later and let these structures and repertoire expansions find purposes. Be alert, of course. What could this ever be used for? What scale should we use this idea, etc. And that is the way we've done these projects. They're starting with systems and we're doing these workshops, etc. And then later on, we're developing a program based on what could this be used for. So that's for to form the program heuristics. Now, you have to do many of those. When you get a brief, of course, you have the program given. But because you have this background that search that huge space of examples, then you can, this could be used here. Or we have 3, 4, and then we test them out. But we couldn't have started looking at that brief, if we hadn't for years accumulated a repertoire and solutions and ideas and projects, which always start with form and then find program, then we have already examples of program. Oh, here's an urban condition, here's an opera house, here's a museum, here's an infill, a mixed use. So we had examples to draw from, as well as reusing formal systems. So that's the way we work. And you can say the way we work cannot be isolated to project by project. The way we work is a whole kind of large group of people extended into multiple university studios and peer groups. And that's all of that comes to bear. All of that is kind of allowing us to make these innovations and realizations. So and also then later on, all this material research, this fabrication research, these tectonic researches, knowing what we can kind of later on also build and realize. So that's really the way we work, and it's really this kind of extended search space. I mean, on every project, then we have many simultaneous studies drawing from that big catalog, and then testing out. Somebody's preparing the brief and three-dimensionalizing that. So we're starting from two ends, and then we see how they match and how this works. And that's my involvement is at this point, telling, suggesting what else can be drawn in, or then making selections. That's the process, but it really is an extended network of explorations, which are then kind of brought to bear on project by project.
And you are still working on expanding this repertoire the same way, right? So,
yes. Well, I mean, the balance, let's say there's these cycles of innovation in the paradigm development. Of course, at the beginning, through the 90s and the 2000s, there was more repertoire expansion and more, spreading, and then later on more selecting, funneling, realizing, and more technical translation and having examples already. So the balance is shifting, right? From exploration to rationalization, application, maturing. We have more, we now brought in on projects which are burdened with a lot of parameters and performance criteria, time, cost, big, massive infrastructure project, airports or mixed use. So, it's different from doing an installation or doing in a museum, an art institute. So that's one thing. So the balance shifts, but we have research teams. So we're developing capacity. I'm teaching PhDs. We have still doing design research where this exploration is still going on. I think the overall balance is shifting away from more repertoire expansion to more application and rationalization, but it's not shut down. And particularly with AI, we opened up again, let's say, repertoire exploration more extensively. But also when we use AI, we also oftentimes quite focused in training up these LoRa models for every project. And also we're training now Tectonism, which isn't the capacity of any AI system at this point. We're training Tectonism fit networks. So then we are more preconceived, at least more strategic, and not so wide open. And I think that makes sense with respect to an overarching cycle of innovation of what I call, let's say, the build environment for the post-Fordist network and knowledge economy society. The broad criteria and agendas and performance criteria and success criteria are relatively clearer now. So that's why also, let's say, if you had modernism in the 20s, there was much more exploration. You had the Bauhaus, all the artists. You had to weed out expressionism and the excesses of suprematism and so on. And then you kind of home in. So it is similarly dynamic, let's say, and this was the paradigm of Fordism. And when it comes to the paradigm of post-Fordism in the architecture, so we had this kind of massive revolutionary explorative period, from postmodernism to deconstructivism to early folding, and then a kind of maturing and reading and in application mode. The tragedy is that there's only few who are in that application mode. So the exploration continues, but it's the relative focus and proportions of wild experimentation versus focused research and development, that has shifted towards focused research and development.
And what feeds your imagination? Do you go back to some of the original sources? Is it art? Is it your own architecture? Is it architecture that you like? Where do you get the inspirations?
Yeah, I mean, well, nature, but again, it's helpful to set up systematic searches. So the studios we've done on looking at landscape formations and letting students go around and look at ice formations, on mountain formations, on organic or organismic, let's say this whole thing of biomimicry or biomimetic research also could work into architecture, vernacular mimetics, if you like, for adapting to local materials, passive systems, local environmental. So I'm not kind of art sometimes, yes, Anish Kapoor. I mean, definitely going to some of his amazing spaces and structures has influence, and you can see it in some of our, let's say, if you compare we've done at the Serpentine Sackler, the North Gallery, and what Anish Kapoor put up in the Turbine Hall, Great Turbine Hall, there are these connections as well, of course. So it could be from anywhere. It could be, and also computer graphics and, tools like processing and what you can do, and looking at early the developer of processing, an artist, and what he's generating. And in DRL we have multiple studios, and there's been this kind of a great kind of Otto style material research explorations, are kind of nearly like a physics experiments and material form finding experiment. These are still kind of unexplored, I mean, unexhausted, let's say. They're inexhaustible, perhaps. So these will be inspirations I look for, but of course I'm looking at what other architects are doing and so on and so forth as well. But if it's the work of Otto remains a source of inspiration.
I was gonna ask you, how do you start the project, but it seems like your projects don't just start, they really continue from what you already have. So
yeah, and there always been families of projects, and yeah, it's more kind of populations of projects, if you like.
So you don't just start, you kind of
Yeah.
continue.
We're continuing an investigation, and that's the advantage. Every Monday morning we get new kind of. We always have at any time we have these 5 master plans, and then there's new coming in. There's going to be always some cultural building, some urban conditions, some mixed use. We have a whole kind of family of towers. We evolving in these populations of projects, and the individual project is always one of a series, and we have now this huge internal repertoire and reservoir of references, but it keeps being augmented it also has its own dangers that we kind of repeat too many things, but if they haven't been done yet, if you're losing a competition or we have studies which remain on the back of my mind, hey, it's a shame it didn't happen. Let's do this idea here. This time it might work out. And then so that's also important. That makes it very kind of agile and resourceful, that we have all these things to draw on, as well as continuously having a number of students. It's not only me teaching, it's about 50, 60 people teaching different studios around the world. And some of that will come through. I sometimes go to juries on this stuff, on some of these studies and so on. So there's always this staying kind of exposed, remaining I've exposed myself to a lot of let's say on architectural exploration.
When I ask you about your progress, progress in your work, you said every time you finish a project, you start thinking about other ideas. We look back at buildings built 10 or 5 years ago, and you see how they could be done differently now. So I think we're getting better, you said. You can also look at other fields of design, such as car industry, for example, and see how they handled and perfected convex and concave geometry. The same as in architecture, we've been working with a certain paradigm for so many years. We continue to push in the same direction. So, of course, there is a progression, and we are getting better. We are developing virtuosity by refining and perfecting our techniques, sensitivities, and ideas. And I wonder, this makes your work kind of more, in a way, predictable, because a lot of architects are not getting better. They're not really progressing, and a lot of the work is done early on. But in your case, at least you are absolutely convinced that you are learning from the previous experience and you are consistently improving
Yeah, I mean,
work.
the paradigm has, set up the heuristics, let's say, of the paradigm has set up that if you had time on an individual project, you could always make iterations and ratchet up the ambition and make them more sophisticated. So, for instance, when we talking about paradigm and heuristics of parametricism, so all elements are parametrically variable. So you could have a blob with a number of parameters, or you have a repertoire of several. You can always increase the number of parameters you can play in your elements and how many how many families of elements you have. So you can increase there. You can then, it's about building systems and fields and arrays of these elements somehow, and you can increase the differentiation and basically the range on the parameter formation, not only the number of parameters. And then when it comes to correlating the systems internally within the building onto the context, you can always do more. You're already responding and fitting and absorbing a number of influences. But then you say, but there's a river out here. Could it also be reflected here? Or there's a tower here. Can we bring that in simultaneously? So you can always do more. And same, then you then kind of articulate into the technologies. You can optimize further and keep many simultaneous ambitions at play. So you can make something super refined. It's a bit like, if you compare an earthworm to a snake, you can see the similarity. But you can also see that the one has evolved, much longer, or anyway, has been more cumulatively evolving kind of differentiation, sophistication, which also makes the snake way superior to an earthworm and can also scale up and is a serious, bright and agile predator. And the worm is just kind of, undifferentiated thing you could. So that's the way I also see, let's say, a lot of our colleagues' architecture out of that kind of degree of simplicity and like an earthworm, you know. And what we do are more kind of, intricately articulated and, evolved organisms, if you like, which have also therefore much higher performance and potency. So that's where you can always do more. Another round of evolutionary optimization. And that means within each project, but of course, project to project. Now it's a tough call, and you have to, the problem is you have always new people and they have to be trained up. And it's not easy if you have 500 people to kind of spread this to everybody. so that there's a slight unevenness with some of the projects. So that's why we put also our kind of top team on the more important projects. And it's a kind of a struggle. It's non-trivial, but then of course the tools keep evolving, and we have the code team evolving the tools to training up people, disseminating the agendas. So we're getting better. And I mean, it's easier for a car company. They have these five models, but if you put them decade by decade, you can see the trajectory of refinement, the way the headline is massaged into and more complex itself and continues with the surface and the interior. Many more elements are integrated, but better integrated. Surface continuity with different materials, the seaming, the kind of, so that we can compare that to what we would love to do with our buildings. And you can also look at it. Sometimes that I would express my agenda like this. Let's say, look at the kind of super articulated building like a Richard Rogers, even Lloyd's or something like this. But it's an industrial paradigm, and it's non-organic. Then you get glimpses where can you have that level of articulation and systems sub-articulation, but make organic, make parametric, rather than having a parametric which is only a tessellation of concrete tiles, but maybe more that kind of, and that's why if one, skeleton, the details, and they have glimpses of this kind of Rogers canopy where it's carbon fiber, elegant, optimized, technically and structurally optimized kind of beam, but it's only a small canopy. They can't deliver on a large building. We haven't delivered on a large building, and we're trying, let's say. And so there is a certain vision, a certain agenda where I say it is how do you move from the earthworm to the snake in terms of our projects, but and also the versatility. I mean, the endless forms of nature also means if you put our repertoire out, if you spread that out, all the kind of morphological types and degrees of complexity, compact, network-like, all these families, there's a huge variety, morphological variety, and also in terms of materials and so on. And all of them should be sophisticated. So that's a tall order. But in terms of an oeuvre, I mean, I recently you said 2006, let's fill the Guggenheim Museum. I would love to do that again. And it could be a double size museum, and we could show how much we've achieved and what we can do with. And if you compare, I once had this epiphany when I saw the Renzo Piano show in Rome a few years ago, and was stunning. I said, my God, okay, this one office, this one guy, this one team has done, you know, more than the whole of the Italian Renaissance put together in terms of versatility and sophistication. On the other hand, you can say, well, there's still, Gothic cathedral. Okay, that took 150 years, and there's repetitive elements, but there's still something there, or St. Peter's, where we could still say, hey, what would be the St. Peter's of today? So I have these dreams of projects, which are surpassing everything which has ever been seen. And I think with the sufficient challenge of brief sight and budget, we could deliver something which outshines St. Peter by a mile.
Yeah, speaking of the work of Renzo Piana and progress, I remember speaking to him when he used to have an office across from the Whitney Museum in New York, and
Yeah.
he could not see any progress from the
Yeah.
Pompidou Center to the Whitney Museum. And then finally he said that that was not the point. The progress was not the point. There was a very different time. And the time when the Pompidou was built was very progressive. It was very revolutionary. We live in a different time. And so here we have the
Yeah,
Whitney
except I
Museum.
mean he in you're quite right that there is some refinements, but overall this paradigm doesn't lend itself to this kind of cumulative exponential refinement. There's just on different versions more of similarly good things. So it doesn't lend itself to this kind of uh, progressive trajectory
Which you
that
do have,
we
right?
have. Definitely, as I said, the
Because it's a different
inherently
focus.
inherently parametricism and for instance, also the move from parametricism to tectonism is a kind of leap forward within an overarching paradigm, because we have in parametricism we had these kind of NURB surfaces, and of course we had swarms, but the many more types of geometry and global surface quality, whether you go in curve folding, ruled surfaces, active bending surfaces, reticulated shell only. I mean, and plus the rationality it increases, which also reduces the portée and can show more the subsystems and structures. So there's a norm and the richness and the articulation, the repertoire which we need for the semiological project in terms of articulating, showing what belongs together, but also differentiating more. So in normal parametricism repertoire, to do a large project like Google Campus would fall into monotony, whereas the tectonism can be both coherent, continuous, and much more conspicuously differentiated. The number of materials and so on and so forth. So there's a massive advance in sub-paradigm, which that's why it deserves a new name for a subsidiary style or paradigm. It's still parametricism, but then also, of course, once you start on the trajectory of tectonism, you can do these versions up. But for one of the best things we've designed, where we spent an enormous amount of time, is unbuilt, is the presidential palace for Algiers, for Bouteflika. It's not known, not much published, but the amount of studies and let's say that was one of the things where I say, wow, not in scale, but this is kind of surpassing the best Baroque churches, palaces on many levels. So yes, this is not possible in the so much in the paradigm under which Renzo Piano is working.
In a few terms, how would you describe parametricism and the difference between parametricism and tectonism? And
well, it's basically parametricism encompasses and embodies, is overarching, and it's gone through a series of subsidiary styles, starting with fold-ism, blob-ism, swarm-ism, and then tectonism brings in basically these engineering rationales and logics very explicitly, with a whole suite of new tools, Rhino Vault, topology optimization, various tools for the skeleton formation. So there's a whole new capacities and tools completely within the value systems of parametricism, but with higher levels, degrees of rationality. Also when it comes, to fabrication logics, environmental logics, more sophisticated, so we can run these scripts of sun exposure and let them drive geometry differentiations. This was the first, generative components. We started experimenting with this before I had the notion of tectonism. We started to use that kind of thinking, and you can have this kind of, it's the scripting technology, which was then parametricism, but now using these engineering rationalities come through. And that makes it more versatile and more rational, more efficient. But it also makes it more beautiful, because these rationalizations have an intricacy and coherence at the same time, which we can recognize. I think we have an instinctive, intuitive sense of recognizing the complexity and potency of a creature, because we should distinguish a snake from an earthworm or from a log. There's something which is awe-inspiring in a highly organized creature, and that's not reducible to scale. And so I think we can, but there's also, so we can notice and get attracted to something highly, what I call, organized complexity or complex variegated order, um, we can sense and we see that there's some underlying organizing principles at work. So there's some kind of both richness and intricacy, but also some kind of lawful regularity at work whether it's an urban environment or a piece of architecture or an organism. So that what we are responding to, and the tectonism creations, they just have more richness and more multiple morphologies with a kind of new level of constraining rigor, which I think is what we can perceive. And so that's why that's the primary difference. The underlying, let's say, socioeconomic, sociological life process problematic is the same. It's just we can feed that much better. And I've been talking a lot about what I call the semiological project. When I show the difference from parametricism and tectonism, you can see immediately the much richer repertoire, which is then richer repertoire of articulation. So your palette of making distinction and connections, the network of similitudes and contrasts, is much richer. So you can articulate a complex institution with its affiliations and subdivisions and connections. You can inverted commas, you can articulate and communicate that much better with tectonism than with parametricism only. So these kind of repertoire expansion is driven to one hand. You can have a simultaneous, you have two kind of agendas simultaneously addressed. One is all the technical functionality, which is always good, and you can save space and have less machine room and less Porsche and keep more open and transparent and light-footed. But also, so these are also socially functionally kind of relevant already through their technical high performance. But at the same time, you always have many choices now to do a shell or to do a structure or to do an environmental filtering. So you have a larger repertoire to use it for the semiological project. And so you have this kind of much larger palette. And that is, I think, very important for social functionality. So you avoid the kind of disorienting monotony in the built environment, and you can generate character, intuitively recognizable character and resonances and affiliations. You know what belongs together, more or less, and you can kind of have recognizability and characterful intuitive grasp and atmosphere articulated much better. Is if you go from somebody that has to sketch something is only allowed to use pencil and straight lines, and somebody who use a full-on repertoire of colors and washes and etc. etc. So that there's this kind of potency of communication. So I'm talking about the communicative capacity of the built environment and of the architect's competency in terms of allowing the client to communicate their offerings and broadcast their offerings into the city with distinctness, and internally also guide and structure and set up these platforms of interaction recognizably. For that is a very important element. And I think this is what I've been emphasizing. So my book on tectonism shows actual available tectonism, the whole movement and what they've achieved, and what I would wish we more consciously apply it to in terms of the semiological project. So this is a kind of wished for next stage of tectonism, which is also what I called a year before I published, or a few years ago, Parametricism 2.0, where the movement should start focusing on social functionality more explicitly. But there needs to be a kind of contribution within the movement. And if the movement was larger, we would have that. You have various types of protagonists in the division of labor of a movement. which come together. Somebody who's kind of promoting and arguing, but also enhancing and advancing what I call social functionality agendas.
Is there a particular building that indicates this transition from parametricism to tectonism?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few buildings, there. None of them is kind of a full kind of Monty, if you like, but I do think, for instance, Serpentine North Gallery, the tensile structure, the beautiful integration of these columns and light, and there is, there's aspects even in larger projects like the Flushing Airport. There's some nice work in some of in the kind of timber football stadium coming along. Some of these projects like the Central Bank of Iraq, which is finishing, which is more environmental logic driven, structural and environmental, or the King Abdullah Center for Energy Research in Riyadh is environmental logic driven. So it's tectonism, environmental engineering logics driving. In Central Bank of Iraq, there is the coincidence, kind of simultaneously addressing structure and environmental, kind of differential shading. So these are good examples, I would say. It's some of this kind of work on structural optimization and expression in the Miami Tower, to some extent, the Morpheus exoskeleton. These are, works of, reasonable, quite large works, and there's many competitions. Oftentimes when we go with a lot of differentiated brise-soleil expression or exoskeleton, the risk is that we don't win. Why? Because these still are perceived to be expensive. Eventually they should be more optimal. They should be, passive systems, and so if the making is sufficiently automated, the end game for tectonism is reduction in material footprint as well as environmental footprint, and therefore cost reduction. The tonnage comes down, and it's more, and we substitute material with information, and information processing and information handling becomes more efficient. So eventually these works will be not only generate more benefit, but also have lower costs. But oftentimes what we feel is, when we see that some of these approaches are not, they scare clients still a little bit. So
If you were to put together 5 or 7, absolutely key projects built by Zaha Hadid architects chronologically, key highlights, what would
yeah,
they?
if I go, it's interesting. I mean, if I pick up the larger ones, I mean, let's say I start with Maxi as a breakthrough. In terms of only the BuildWorks, breakthrough BuildWorks, Maxi, then Wolfsburg. Then I would say, although it had some flaws, Gwangju Opera House and the third crossing in Abu Dhabi for a big bridge project we're proud of. So if you go up that, I think one of the key projects then, more or less at the same time, the Dongdaemun Design Center in Seoul and Baku, the Heidi Aleph Center, are critical. But there's also, I would mention something which the Innsbruck stations, these kind of system of type and variation, genotype, phenotype, and local adaptation, concrete, steel, glass as a correlative sort of subsystems iterating us through 4 stations, I think is very, very important. As how moving on to, well, I mean, I might be jumping over something. I think the Miami Tower is a breakthrough, Morpheus, Dashing Airport, but also some of the, I think on a scale, on an urban scale, the now finishing is we did, over about 1.5 million square meter, and think more than 25 buildings in the Unicorn Island complex in Chengdu. But also, if I think of urbanism, we're very proud sort of the, let's say, first parametric urbanism success in One North in Singapore. So we started in the year 2000. 25 years later, it's largely built out and I think quite compelling. So I would also want to mention that. And of course, I mean, there's many other great projects like the recently opened Science Museum in Shenzhen, and we have coming up Oppo headquarters and Tower C right next to each other. They're amazing. I think a new level of scale and sophistication. So the Oppo headquarters tower has several volumes, largely unencumbered, cores pulled out, so learning from Rogers, then allowing atriums. I mean, the Lise Tower is another one, and Galaxy actually. Galaxy and Lise Tower have to be mentioned as well. Blob-ism, where you have our own office bridging and courtyards, and in Galaxy Beijing, and then the Lise Tower, the atrium. There's another one coming up, a kind of triple tower in Wuhan. So I think I would put together these are the roughly the highlights. There's a wonderful stadium just finishing with a beautiful structure, beautiful facade. There's also the Xi'an Stadium recently finished, but now one coming up with it. They've opened up the whole side of the stadium with a massive arch onto the waterfront. So it's also a new type. Um, it's it's happening, let's say. Mumbai Airport finishing as well. The Jiangzhou Bridge, huge bridge in Taiwan. So I think we have quite a few, and maybe I also want to mention the Shaoxing Opera House and Cultural Complex. I mean, with the performing arts, beautiful landscape and two museums, beautiful exterior spaces. Something which is coming up. I'm sure I've forgotten something, the Henderson, etc. But these would be the highlights.
What if I ask you for a single
Oh God.
absolute
No, not yet.
favorite?
There's no, I can't. I can't. It's
And I wonder
ask
if
me in
it would.
25 years. Ask me in 25 years.
So you
Which,
think it's a kind of building that's not built yet? So you
yeah,
wouldn't
yeah,
go
absolutely.
too
Yeah.
far into the
Yeah,
past.
yeah.
You would
I think
look
there's
into the
nothing
future.
which I feel is fully satisfying.
What I find absolutely amazing is that I think you mentioned somewhere that about you win about 30-40% of all the competitions that you enter. Is it still the case?
To some extent, I mean, probably once we've entered, now it's gotten a bit harder to get onto the shortlist. I mean, if I take out Germany, we have done about 100 competitions in the last 15 years, all of which we lost. Bizarrely, they hate us there. They have something, there's a mismatch, a misconception, a prejudice, a false stereotype, and I heard from students who are German, they think the professors, we always come up as the wrong examples. We're kind of outcast somehow. So if I discount that, I think the ratio is still roughly there. It's getting harder to get onto the shortlist with in China. Competition is huge, and you have to do sketches to get on. But yeah, I think roughly is correct. I mean, we just won Vilnius at new airport. I mean, it's, and we have about 25 building under constructions to be finished in the next 2-3 years.
How many buildings have you completed?
I don't know.
Do you know?
I haven't recently counted. But it's interesting that, let's say, what we're going to do, what is finishing in the next 5 years, probably as much as in the first 25 years. So we're more efficient. We're not much larger. We're over 500, but we've kind of not been able to grow much. But of course, through all this tooling and maturing, we can, and particularly with respect to partners in China, we have a larger footprint. We can do more. We work much faster. And some of these projects, like the Science Fiction Museum, from the first sketch to opening in a year,
Is there one particular project that you are working on right now that's really exciting, and for what reasons?
Well, I'm personally, I mean, look, there are many great. We're just working on. We have our great things in the running of competitions still undecided. So I don't want to talk about those, but I'm personally very much invested in the Metaverse, which we founded as a company. It's a Delaware Incorporated company. We're looking for funding, but we already it's called Metotopia, and it's going to be the go-to hub for the whole of the design community ecosystem for all architectural firms and industrial design and fashion and automotive brands and designers and conferences and media, etc. And I think it will happen, and we're building it out quite nicely. We just made the platform totally independent as a kind of self-proprietary platform with a lot of assets in there. Team is still very small, looking for investors, but I'm working continuously on that personally. Uh, and I had a number of metaverse exploration at the AADOL to feed into that thinking. And so that's what I'm most excited about, let's say, because I think this is 100% within the domain of architecture. It's directly competing with the venues and spaces we would otherwise design. So competes and substitutes a lot of physical venues, but it also will take over a large part of the internet, where every organization that has a website will have virtual spaces, probably gathering various virtual clusters or cities, and at least every organization that has building will certainly have virtual spaces. So that's I find very exciting, and with a lot of this, whatever we do here will also feed back into the physical built environment, I would believe, where you can explore, for instance, responsive and active AI-empowered architectural agents, self-organization, etc. We explore that first in the metaverse before we bring it into the physical. We can have a lot of and thinking about the integration of virtual and physical spaces, all these hybrid events we're doing, and how much of our lives we're already spending digitally, but in kind of graphic designer spaces, should be architecture spaces.
You recently went to Venice Architecture Biennale, which is obviously the most important event in the profession. It really sets a tone for architectural discourse every 2 years. I wonder what is your impression after the visit, and maybe you can mention some highlights.
Yes, so I've been very frustrated with the Venice Biennale over the quite a few years, and I've expressed that every year, and I got a lot of good resonance from colleagues who also felt frustrated. And this time, it was actually quite exhilarating. I was quite satisfied with the show in the Arsenal. So the Carlo intervention was very positive, with very few exceptions. I thought the first two installations, when you come in, belong more to the kind of previous era of, let's say, the Vogue takeover of the field and of the Biennale. But that was kind of after we went through that, there was really a lot of interesting work, a lot of research-based work, academic work, but expressed in experimental structures, models, pavilions. I would say largely tectonism, the latest stage of parametricism. So a lot of digital fabrication-based work, which is of course also using optimized geometries and computational design inputting into digital fabrication. So the highlights, I mean, there were many great installations. He's in the center, there were a number of important pieces. I would highlight the Philip Yuan project from Tongji and Archi Union, his company and research lab, which was structure assembled from charred timber and then making a network there, computation design network, and then scooping that out and carving that out with milling, robotic milling. And then I think close to that was a computationally knitted fabric, which was in a beautiful tensile structure, relatively large scale. Then outside the immediate curated, there was the Foster Pavilion with Porsche design. That was a nice piece of Parametricism and Tectonism. So outside, somebody who was from Schleichbergermann created this kind of marble piece of marble, which was very long and with a large cantilever with the cable integrating, so expressing tensile and compression elements. And there were similar structures like that. So there's a lot of experimental, not complete buildings. I mean, this, I guess, is also because in this paradigm of tectonism, there aren't that many large completed buildings. And they wanted to show one-to-one experiments, I guess, rather than just documenting. So that's where I understand this. So I was quite satisfied. We were also involved and included in a small installation showing our work on Metaverse. So yeah, I was satisfied with this, but the rest of the Biennale was more like it has been over the years. I mean, yeah, there are, of course, a single individual can do a lot through the arsenal and the Biennale director or curator. But the rest of the national pavilions, there's more inertia, obviously. They didn't get the signals because also when Calorati announced his, he also had a lot of gestures and rhetoric nodding towards some kind of woke thinking. So it wouldn't have been easily picked up by the national pavilions. And anyway, they have their own agendas and their own inertia. So there was largely, as we have seen, the absence of any architects, curatorial statements, maybe slightly, I mean, there are a few highlights, like the Serbian pavilion had an interesting computation in its structure. So very much in the spirit of what Ratti was curating in the Arsenal. There were a few national pavilions who picked up on that to some extent or were congenial. I would say there's some elements of the Turkish pavilion as well. And a little bit perhaps in the Chinese pavilion. So yeah, but overall, I would say the national pavilions, including the British, were again, Vogue takeover, not much, no scope, no invitation. Contemporary architects showing their work, discussing project or selecting innovative projects to be discussed. Nearly nothing of the kind. I mean, the French pavilion actually had some. I mean, they were renovating, so they just had about interesting 50 panels of or more different projects, architects. It's a shame that they couldn't be represented more with models, etc. So it's just graphic panels. But at least here were current works being presented. So it was slightly less depressing, let's say, even on the Gini and the National Pavilion front than 2 years earlier. Two
Yeah,
years earlier, we had only the Chinese pavilion basically and a few Chinese architects in the arsenal, plus David Ajay, I would say, who did a very impressive show. And the rest was like over many years really had mutated away from being an architectural biennale to be some kind of current affairs and social justice biennale, let's say.
yeah.
And
This is something that you expressed in one of your articles in this was a journal for architecture and philosophy, Korean.
yes,
Year you said Well, the name of the article is called The End of Architecture. And you said in this very critical piece that architecture as an autonomous theory-led discipline has ceased to exist. You continued, academic institutions, biennials, and professional critiques have abandoned their roles as incubators of architectural thought, instead engaging with tangential socio-political issues that stray from architecture's core competency. So I actually absolutely agree with you, and I also agree that we have seen a kind of turn in this Biennale towards real architectural, experimentations and examples. And I think that most architects would agree with you, but only in private. Publicly, we still have a kind of consensus on what kind of architecture needs to be created nowadays. So there are very few agendas such as sustainability, ecological material.
Look, and I've written a subscript on the concept of sustainability because it is related to our field and we can contribute to that. But that's why it isn't just a kind of distraction or substitution through an alien topic, which I feel a lot of the Biennale and schools of architecture have been committing. But there's also a problem with the way the sustainability agenda dominates, let's say, professional discourses, particularly when it comes to conferences or when you present your projects. But with respect to conferences and exhibitions and so on within the field, there's nearly no other topic anymore. And there I have my issues with, particularly because I'm arguing that when it comes to sustainability, we're actually addressing only a cost side, so the carbon cost. And yes, that could be minimized, like economic cost also, if you know what you would like positively to develop. But that's not trivial. So we need to spend, I think the bulk of our discourse should be spent on what are our solutions, not only on the cost side, but on the benefit side, on the driving human purposes and the agendas which, let's say, motivate building and development in the first place for contemporary society. How should these developments, urban patterns, morphologies, articulations, how should they function? How should they look like? What are the criteria of success here for social functionality and how we can develop them? That whole discourse is kind of swamped when we're talking about sustainability. It's as if we take for granted what the solutions are, what they look like, and that they were just trivially what we've always been doing in world commerce, and now we just do the same thing with a smaller carbon footprint. And that's a big fallacy when it's convenient and easy, because it's quite challenging to think about how we innovate the built environment according to the human purposes, societal agendas, etc., new technologies, new ways of life, and so on. If we do, and that's a more straining, also I feel exciting agenda to discuss, where we need theoretical resources and ideas and creative thinking and tool development, etc. So that is it's convenient to kind of withdraw from that and focus on the which is has kind of also of course moral overtones of doing the right thing, being responsible by focusing on reducing carbon footprint, etc. So that's been an article. I think it's also criticisms have to be levied. This not so much in the arenas of cultural communication and schools, although in schools it's also prevalent, but it's in the professional discursive arenas. So they have been totally swamped and taken over by sustainability agendas. And I have my own idea about sustainability. And let's say I prefer the architectural side of things, where there's organizing and developing morphologies and passive systems and shading, etc., rather than the engineering agenda of more efficient machines, embodied carbon, and so on. which don't really drive architectural morphology in the same way. So there's another element in that text in my critique, so that we are only talking about the cost side, and in fact talking as architects, taking our communications are taken over in a sense by an engineering agenda in this sense when it comes to embodied carbon, etc. So that's another element of that. Of course, there's also coming through in the Biennale to some extent, but more symbolically. So I actually haven't bothered to look, but if you come into the Biennale, there was this kind of gloomy room where somebody did something which was very similar to Robert Wilson's kind of pool, oil pool, which is a spectacular artworks I kind of remember from 20 years ago. But not with oil, with water. I think it was a kind of humid and unpleasant. I suspect it should remind us viscerally about global warming. I don't know. So then I mean I don't think these things are meaningful. So you have a huge expense on the whole room to have a kind of one-liner symbolic message, global warming, as if if we could ever escape from that
Yeah.
warning being kind of leveled. And then the second installation was also a symbolic installation of population growth and some graphics and some big sculpture expressing an idea. So I think that's bad art. Symbolic, expressive info sculptures or just messages. This has been the kind of spirit, and that's what you also get in the British Pavilion. Um, some kind of symbolic, highly expensive, elaborate, let's say it's sculpture, which is pushing some message. Um, so that's is a misunderstanding. I mean, we architects don't need to look at this, and the general public will also not understand what architecture is about. So if we spend that amount of money and effort on a large space, that shouldn't be a kind of symbol. It should actually be an experiment and revealing through its potential for structuring life, not as a messaging, a moral, but
Yeah.
showing
I,
how we might build in the future. So that was even in this Biennale, even at the Arsenal, I think there was this kind of right at the beginning, uh, a some kind of um, this fallacy, which I find very typical, was committed.
I agree with you, and most of the architecture turned into this kind of ideological kind of tool, and all of these messages are fine, except for the fact that we've been hearing them for over a decade, and the message has not changed. Only the expressions.
Yeah, and
Just
the message, look, I mean,
we're not progressing.
the issues, for instance, with, as a schools of architecture, find that, you set projects in favelas or in informal settlements or go to the margins of society, the global south. And these are arenas where the problems are not caused by lack of architectural ingenuity, let's say. They're very fundamental. What is lacking is we know because we are enjoying amenities like clean water and space and heated space or air conditioned space and many other things, infrastructural facilities, on and on and on. We know that for 100 years what would be required and what is lacking among many other things in the built environment. So it I don't see how the discipline should be working on the frontier of architectural capacities, ingenuity, technology, integration, and so on and so forth, to develop the repertoire, develop the culture and expertise of architecture. Whereas when these arenas where we then go in schools of architecture and biennales, they don't just need ready, well-known solutions. What's lacking is the economic resources to deliver them. They don't need uh, architectural ingenuity, or if any, and in reality, the discipline, the profession. For instance, if you go to School of Architecture, you do some sort of project. Uh, this will never be a project you will be working on, except very, very marginal cases of charitable NGO-like interventions, very small here and there. But because these situations looking for some other form of resourcing, and also they wouldn't be able to. It wouldn't make sense to spend money on fees of, let's say, Ivy League school educated architects to do where they need all the resources they have to, let's say, put a sewage system in place. So that's why my criticism, this misguidedness. So even though these are problems which we are confronted with globally as a world society, uneven development, poverty, backwardness, and world commerce, etc. They're not, and they have, of course, built environment repercussions. They're not problems for the discipline of architecture to solve. So if we divert the resources and capacities and airspace and thinking time and learning time to a problem which is actually maybe not neither competent nor empowered to act, then this is a waste. And the resources let's say, which are kind of flowing into schools of architecture, the analysis, etc., let's say the discursive arenas and learning arenas, they're not available for developing and accompanying and critiquing what is actually in our task domain and what we're actually trying to work on. And that's when my key point was this: if the discursive arenas, that means biennales, conferences, but also critical journalism in a magazine like a Architectural Review, for instance, as well as academic work in the universities and schools of architecture, if all of that is looking elsewhere, what's going on, what we're trying to do as professional architects is therefore has no discursive space left, is basically bereft of critique, of exchange, of critical feedback, and mutual stimulation through these communications. And that's why I said that's the end of architecture as an theory-led, academic, empowered discourse and discipline. And that's why we've kind of collapsing back to a craft, because the difference between, let's say, a vernacular and architecture emerges in the Renaissance through theory, mostly treatises and discussing, and with an innovation agenda, adapting the built environment to the new kind of dynamics of society. You've had early capitalism of the city-states and the Renaissance, and then into the Baroque, mercantilism, the absolute state, and large kind of administrative structures into in the 19, let's say, neoclassicism together with the bourgeois revolutions and the whole kind of bourgeois society and all the elements of urban facilities and city planning which need to be created. So there's this kind of, there's whole literatures and theories, but also the expansion of design capacities since the Renaissance. We can fully design and simulate through perspective and rendering what we're proposing, and these are innovations now in the contemporary condition where any book about architecture is, let's say, within the field, is discussing other things, and then we have no longer this support and discursive communication. And it also shows up that, in fact, there is little innovation coming through in the built environment in the advanced countries. So if I look around in London and when I see what's being built, it's very conservative. It's very much what could have been designed easily 80 years ago, 100 years ago even. there's maybe certain invisible technical improvements in some of the systems. Maybe there's a slightly lower, carbon footprint, but ultimately there's this kind of um, lack of freedom of expression, experimentation in the built environment. That's partly because the built environment and development in advanced countries has been so politicized as well. So it's been kind of,
I can assure you that
yeah,
as far as the carbon footprint, it's gone way up. I can
that's as
assure you
well,
of
I guess. And
that.
the price, the costs, the other tragedies, of course, the economic costs of developments are going up because there are so many risks, planning risks, so many delays, so many difficulties, and so many impositions and compliance and regimes and um, planning and political costs attached.
Yeah.
That prices are unaffordable, become unaffordable. That's a fact, comes out of the politics, but also it just discourages any architectural innovation because the product is pretty much given and prescribed by planners. The volume, building lines, the product mix, in particular on the residential side, how many residences of what type, each feature and room is specified, the facade is prescribed, the material is described. There's very little entrepreneurship involved from any developer, and really very minimal nuances and on the kind of marginal parameters can be tinkered with on the architectural side. And that if you know that's what your work is going to be like, that feeds back into what you're interested in exploring, that feeds back to some extent in the schools, into the biennales. That architecture has become so boring that we rather want to talk about other things. And then also, of course, with respect to the planning applications and the whole process, there's also kind of a woke overdrive, let's say, and rhetoric, uh, which you also have to bring to the table, and that feeds into this, I think, this pretty repetitive discourse, as you said. There's been uh, the same kind of spin put on buildings, and I call it a bit spin. I mean, community engagement, etc. There's too much of it because community engagement usually is prevention of development, scaling down of development, delaying of development. That's the primary um, effect of all this community engagement discourse. So it's actually a discourse of prevention and yeah, it's very depressing. And that's why we are kind of moved our discipline into the condition of craft, a kind of contemporary vernacular. It's no longer architecture, it's the end of architecture. And the way we could close down all these academic arenas and schools of architecture, if that's what it is, then you just have companies and apprentices more efficiently and quickly can learn the tricks of the trade, including the rhetoric. I mean, it's a bleak outlook, but that's what we are facing.
Thank you, Patrick. I
Okay.
would like to make a prediction. It would be, I think, very healthy for the profession if you were given a chance to direct the next Biennale.
I would love to. I would love to.